Today is April 26th, 1 year after Avengers Endgame came out. I will be ranking all 23 MCU movies, so comment below your ranking. Thanks for clicking on this video. I'm Movie Micah, and let's get started. In last place, number 23, is The Incredible Hulk. The big problem is how disconnected this movie is to the rest of the MCU. For one, Mark Ruffalo plays Bruce Banner in the rest of the MCU, but in this movie, Edward Norton plays him. The only thing in this movie that really connects is General Ross. It's pretty easy to skip this one during a movie marathon, and I just don't really enjoy this movie while I'm watching. It is less enjoyable overall because there is a lack of humor compared to the rest of the MCU. There are still some good things in The Incredible Hulk, like the action, but this is not a great movie overall. Number 22 is Thor: The Dark World. This movie has the worst, most boring villain in the MCU, which is Malekith. There's no character development in Thor: The Dark World, and it feels like nothing happened throughout the whole movie that was important. Some parts do matter, however, because it introduces us to the Reality Stone, but still, the characters just aren't good enough to carry the movie along. The action is okay in the final battle, but overall not a memorable MCU film compared to the rest. Number 21 is Iron Man 2. There are way too many plot lines going on in this movie, and it never really focuses in on one at a time. I would have liked this movie a lot more if they focused more on the Whiplash storyline, because he could have been a great villain. I think the action in this movie is really good when it actually happens, because there's not actually that much of it in here. I would actually say the action when it happens is as good, if not better, than in the first Iron Man movie. In the end, it is a good but pretty messy MCU film. Don't get me wrong, but number 20 is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I'm not the hugest fan of this movie's plot, because the main villain Ego is introduced nearly halfway through the film, and until then you have pretty stupid villains, like the Sovereign and Taserface. This film can be enjoyable because they went for a lot of humor, but for me, a lot of the jokes didn't really land very well. I really like what they did with some of the characters, especially Yondu was elevated a lot inside of this movie. This is a good, fine film, but you have to understand it has some really great competition. That's why it lands this low on the list. Number 19 is Iron Man 3. The plot is just fine for me, but I do understand the comic book fans' perspective on it. It seemed like they switched out a great villain for a pretty mediocre one. Iron Man 3 doesn't feel connected enough to the MCU because Tony blows up all of his suits, then they make us think he's retired, and then he's right back to being Iron Man in Age of Ultron. Iron Man 3 had some potential, but they just didn't handle some of the characters correctly. Number 18 is going to be Captain Marvel. This movie's plot is okay, but Captain Marvel doesn't seem to have a defining personality, and that really annoys me. Her character only seems important because of her power, not really as a person to like and relate to. It may not be the best plot, but they make it super fun while you're watching. The film was very, very fun. I liked seeing Nick Fury as a younger character. The last big problem that I had is that none of the villains had any real chance of beating Captain Marvel. In the end, this movie is very fun to watch, but not all that well thought out, and just not one of the best MCU movies. Number 17 is AntMan. This is a fun, enjoyable movie. Even though it's not trying to be the most epic, it's still very fun to see. The action is good, partly because it makes fun of itself, and it's funny. It knows what it's trying to be. They're shrunk down on a little playset, but the fighting still involves a nice threat to our hero. This one is probably higher on your list, but I like a lot of the MCU movies more than Ant-Man. Number 16 is gotta be Thor. I like the plot where he has to become worthy of his hammer again, and I actually like the Earth segments of the story more than the Asgard parts of it. I wouldn't say this movie's all that enjoyable, but it does set up a very good villain in Loki. I don't entirely like the action in Thor because it doesn't involve high stakes and a good threat, but overall this is a good movie to introduce Thor into the MCU. Number 15 is Ant-Man and the Wasp. The plot for Ant-Man and the Wasp isn't the most interesting, but like the other Ant-Man movie, it's not trying to be the best. Ant-Man and the Wasp is just very enjoyable and lighthearted. It was a much-needed change of pace after seeing what happened in Infinity War, and it was nice to see a Marvel movie without the weight of the universe on its shoulders. The action is fine, even without a large threat, and I think this movie gets done what it wants to get done. Number 14 is going to be Spider-Man Homecoming. This movie has a good plot, which is Peter trying to balance school and being a hero into his life. It was interesting how they skipped the origin story, and I kind of liked it. This is a fun movie with a very good and relatable villain in the Vulture. It was hard, but the big thing that puts this ahead of Ant-Man and the Wasp is the incredible Vulture villain. I guess I'm not the biggest fan of Homecoming, but I still really like that this movie exists. Number 13 is the most recent one, Spider-Man Far From Home. The plot is very good in this movie, and I thought Mysterio was a pretty great villain. The way they revealed him as the main villain was pretty unexpected for me. I really enjoyed the action in Far From Home, and all the scenes with Mysterio's illusions were really awesome. I love the illusion scenes a lot, and I'm super hyped to see what's next for Spider-Man in the MCU. Only problem with this movie is they sacrifice some really good serious moments just for a joke. The jokes are still funny, but it might have been better without some of them. Number 12 is the one that started it all, and that is Iron Man. The plot is great for the first movie in the MCU, and Tony Stark has a really great character arc throughout this movie. This film is very fun, and it's easily the best of the Iron Man films. Although I do feel like most of Iron Man's best moments happen in Avengers films, while he's around other heroes. The action is pretty good, but of course it's not as good as a lot of later movies. This is a great movie to start off the MCU, however. Number 11 is Doctor Strange. I had a hard time deciding if I like Doctor Strange or Iron Man better, but for now, Doctor Strange lands here. The plot isn't the best because it has a pretty boring villain, but then again, this movie isn't really about the villain. It's more about Doctor Strange changing his perspective on magic and the world. This is a very enjoyable movie. One reason for that is the incredible visuals. All the scenes with the mirror dimension and the bending cities are pretty fantastic. One little problem is that it does feel a bit like they squeezed the Doctor Strange story into the Iron Man movie template. I still really like Doctor Strange, and this movie almost makes it to the top 10. Just cracking my top 10 is Avengers Age of Ultron. The sequel to the Avengers has more of just about everything. More plot lines, more characters, and more action. The plot can be confusing at times, but it's still very interesting and good. It's not the most humorous movie in the MCU because it does have less jokes, but this movie might be better without it. Action is the best element in Age of Ultron, especially when there are tons of robots and a flying city. I also like the parts where it has foreshadowing for things that happen later in the MCU. In my opinion, this movie is definitely underrated. Just because it wasn't as good as the first Avengers movie does not mean that it's bad. I really enjoy Avengers Age of Ultron overall, and it's my 10th favorite. Number 9 is Guardians of the Galaxy. I really like the plot for Guardians because it's all about criminals and outlaws turning into a team, and they become the heroes in the end. We also get our first little sneak peek at Thanos and his plan. Ronan is a pretty generic villain, but he doesn't have to be good for this movie to be good. It's pretty crazy what they were able to do in this movie because they took some crazy ideas for characters, like a tree that only says I am Groot and a talking raccoon, and made them work somehow. This is a great film that came from Marvel's biggest risk. My 8th place is Black Panther. The plot is really good in Black Panther, mostly due to both the villains, Claw and Killmonger. This is a very enjoyable movie because of the look of Wakanda and Black Panther's suit. I like how the Killmonger villain makes you think because parts of him were actually correct, although other parts of him were very evil. Black Panther has the highest rating on Rotten Tomatoes of any MCU movie, which is 97%. I don't think it deserves quite that, but at the end of the day, Black Panther is a very great addition to the MCU. In 7th place is Captain America, the first Avenger. The first hour of this movie is one of the best hours in the entire MCU. I love when Steve becomes Captain America and when he goes on the rescue mission. Endgame might have made this movie even better with all the amazing callbacks to it. This is a pretty enjoyable film, and Red Skull is a great villain. but the biggest reason that this movie is all the way in 7th place is because of Captain America, my favorite character in the entire MCU, and my favorite superhero of all time. This movie does a great job of bringing him into the Marvel story. I definitely think the first Avenger is underrated, and I like this movie quite a bit more than most people. Number 6 is Thor Ragnarok. I like almost everything about this movie, and I like how Loki sort of becomes the good guy a little bit. Hela is a really effective and intimidating villain in Thor Ragnarok. This movie is extremely enjoyable and possibly the funniest movie in the entire MCU, and the color scheme only adds to the fun. They changed the character of Thor quite a bit, and it's definitely for the better. The action is super good, and I love how it shows that Thor doesn't even need his hammer to use his powers. I only have one complaint with this film, and it's the same one that I had for Far From Home. They sort of threw away good serious moments just for a joke. I still really love what they did with this movie, and in the end, the other Thor movies are not near as good as Ragnarok. Making my top 5 is gonna be Captain America Civil War. Civil War's plot is better than I thought it would be, but we should have spent more time with the villain Zemo. Captain America Civil War is enjoyable, and even the fight scenes were incredibly fun. This movie leaves you on a really good cliffhanger as well, because the heroes are still divided at the end. The action is nearly perfect in this movie. If you are talking about the airport fight or the final battle, it's all just super awesome to see. I also really love how they made both sides wrong in some ways and right in some ways. Overall, Civil War is a very well thought out movie and another great part of the MCU. My 4th place has got to be Captain America the Winter Soldier. The plot is incredible in Winter Soldier, and I love how Hydra is hidden inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. If you feel like you don't quite understand some of the plot, I really encourage rewatching it before you judge it, because this plot is just phenomenal. I really like how Bucky starts to remember who he is at the end, and I can't find anything really wrong with the characters or the plot in this movie. This is a very enjoyable MCU movie, even without a bunch of humor. It is for the most part a serious film, but they cracked the code to making it still super fun to see. The action is really amazing, even without superpowers, and I love the spy feel of the Winter Soldier movie overall, and it gets 4th place. Cracking the podium is the Avengers, or Avengers Assemble. This is the perfect way to bring all these heroes together for the first time. They did everything right with this plot, and Loki is a great villain, which makes this movie nearly perfect. The action is fantastic in this movie. The whole final battle, you're just super happy to see all these heroes fighting together. This was the most enjoyable movie in the MCU until some pretty recent films, and the Avengers was a huge step up for comic book movies because this team up of superheroes actually worked. This movie will be known as a classic MCU film in years to come. My runner-up MCU film is Avengers Infinity War. Avengers Infinity War is a dream come true for comic book fans and superhero fans. The plot is made perfectly in this film, and Thanos is the best villain in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Avengers Infinity War is extremely enjoyable for almost any Marvel fan, and the action just might be the best in the entire MCU. Almost the whole movie is action, and you might get tired of it, but it's still incredible fighting scenes. This is a big movie for the MCU to experiment with because the heroes don't actually win. I feel like that almost makes this movie more realistic because the good guys don't really win every battle in real life. The big thing that puts this behind my number 1 spot is that in some parts, some of the characters, Star-Lord, don't act as heroic as they should be. I still completely love Infinity War, and it gets my number 2 spot. My favorite MCU movie is Happy Birthday, Avengers Endgame. Nothing in all of film is a bigger accomplishment than all these characters that we know and love coming together in this final battle. This is the most enjoyable movie I've ever seen, and the 10 years of movies before this absolutely pay off. The action was perfection in Endgame. Just so much fun action with almost everyone in the MCU. The characters were executed just right in this movie, except for one, which brings me to my next point. While this movie did have some incredible character moments, I was not a big fan of the Fat Thor plotline because I didn't really enjoy him being used as a joke. However, basically everything else in Endgame is phenomenal. I loved revisiting all the past moments in the MCU, and I can barely see how they could have made this movie better. I can say confidently that Avengers Endgame is my favorite film of all time, and it absolutely deserves the number one spot to me. Thanks for watching my ranking of all 23 MCU movies. I'm Movie Micah signing off, and I will see you next time.